Prologue: The Streets That Made a Monster. The South Bronx, October 27, 1940. In a cramped tenement building, another child enters a world already overcrowded with poverty and desperation. John Joseph Gotti Jr. is born, the fifth of 13 children to Italian immigrant parents John Joseph Gotti Sr. and Filomena Fanny DiCarlo. His father works sporadically as a day laborer, providing little stability for the sprawling family. By age 12, the Gotti family settles in East New York, Brooklyn, where young John grows up in poverty. The father's inability to provide becomes a source of shame and resentment. In the narrow streets and shadowy alleys of this neighborhood, another kind of family beckons, one that promises respect, money, and power through violence and crime. John Gotti drops out of Franklin K. Lane High School at age 16 with a history of truancy and bullying. The classroom holds no appeal for a boy who has already glimpsed the street life. He becomes involved with street gangs associated with New York mafiosi from age 12. The die is cast. The boy who will become America's most infamous mob boss has chosen his path. At 12, Gotti begins working as an errand boy for an underground club run by Carmine Fatico, a captain in the Gambino crime family. He joins the Fulton Rockaway Boys, a local gang. His arrest record accumulates: street fighting, public intoxication, car theft, petty crimes that mark the trajectory of a young criminal finding his place in the underworld. But beneath the bravado and criminal ambition lies something darker, a hunger born of poverty, a need to prove himself, and an anger at a father who never provided for the family. These wounds will shape the man John Gotti becomes: proud, vain, violent, and utterly ruthless. Act 1. The Education of a Gangster. Chapter 1. The Mentor. In February 1968, United Airlines employees identify Gotti as the man who signed for stolen merchandise. The FBI arrests him for hijacking. Gotti, his brother Gene, and friend Angelo Ruggiero have been operating a hijacking crew at what was then Idlewild Airport, now JFK International. All three plead guilty to reduced counts, with Gotti receiving a 3-year sentence. Prison is not wasted time for an ambitious young criminal. It's a finishing school for the aspiring mafioso. But the real education begins after his release in 1971, when Gotti returns to the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club in Queens. It is here that Gotti's destiny truly takes shape. He meets Aniello Della Croce, the underboss of the Gambino crime family. Della Croce is everything young Gotti aspires to be: feared, respected, powerful. His name means Little Lamb of the Cross in Italian, but there is nothing gentle about him. A federal agent would later say of Della Croce, he likes to peer into a victim's face like some kind of dark angel at the moment of death. Della Croce fills Gotti's head with tales of life in the old Mafia under Albert Anastasia. These stories of honor, violence, and absolute loyalty captivate the younger man. A bond forms between mentor and protege that will last until death, and, beyond death, will shape the events that lead to Gotti's rise and ultimate destruction. When Carmine Fatico is indicted on loan sharking charges in 1972 and cannot associate with known felons as a condition of his release, Gotti is named acting capo of the Burgeon crew. He proves himself an effective enforcer, managing the crew's illegal gambling operations. Gotti frequently travels to Della Croce's headquarters at the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan to brief the underboss on crew activities. The two men grow even closer during this time. Chapter 2. Blood Baptism. May 1973. Gotti commits his first murder as a Fatico crew captain when he's assigned to find Jimmy McBratney, a rival gang associate who murdered a member of the Gambino family. The hit squad botches the abduction at a Staten Island bar. McBratney is shot dead in public view, and Gotti's indiscretion, a trait that will define his later career, leads to eyewitnesses identifying him. Arrested in 1974, Gotti pleads guilty to manslaughter and receives only 4 years in prison. But even incarceration cannot contain his ambitions or his connections. While serving his term at Green Haven Correctional Facility in upstate New York, Gotti, apparently bribing prison officials and guards, is allowed to leave to meet with other mobsters at New York City restaurants and even visit his home in Howard Beach, Queens. The Mafia is not just a criminal organization, it's a shadow government with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and the ability to corrupt the very institutions designed to contain it. Young Gotti learns this lesson well. Chapter 3: The Changing of the Guard. 1976, Carlo Gambino, head of the Gambino family, dies. The succession question hangs heavy over the organization. Many expect Della Croce, the loyal underboss, to ascend, but Gambino has other plans. Before his death, Gambino names his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, as his successor, though Della Croce was rightfully next in line. It's a decision that plants the seeds of future bloodshed. Against expectations, Gambino appoints Paul Castellano to succeed him, believing the crime family would benefit from Castellano's focus on white-collar businesses. Castellano is a businessman, not a street gangster. He wears expensive suits and prefers legitimate business ventures to the old-fashioned rackets, hijacking, robbery, extortion that built the family's power. In a gesture of goodwill, Castellano allows Della Croce to remain as the family's underboss, giving him control of 10 of the 23 Gambino crews. Under the tutelage of Della Croce, who was allowed to control nearly half the syndicate, Gotti quickly rises through the ranks after his parole in 1977. But resentment simmers beneath the surface. The street guys, Gotti among them, view Castellano as soft, isolated, greedy. He lacks the street credibility that commands respect in their world. The old way of doing things is dying, replaced by a boss who seems more interested in construction contracts than the blood oath of La Cosa Nostra. Chapter 4: Personal Tragedy. March 1980. Tragedy strikes when Gotti's 12-year-old Frank is killed riding his motorbike. The boy steers into traffic and is struck by a car driven by neighbor John Favara. Frank's death is ruled accidental. However, Favara disappears without a trace 4 months later while Gotti and his family vacation in Florida. Witnesses claim they saw Favara being struck in the head with a club before being forced into a van that left the scene. He is never seen again. Gotti denies involvement, but the message is clear. Those who harmed the Gotti family, intentionally or not, disappear. It's a lesson in the terrible power wielded by mob royalty and a preview of the violence that will define Gotti's reign. Act 2: The Coup. Chapter 5: The Growing Divide. By 1985, the tension between Paul Castellano and the traditional gangsters in the family has reached a breaking point. In February 1985, Gotti's brother Gene is indicted for narcotics trafficking, an activity Castellano prohibits under penalty of death. Gotti becomes increasingly dissatisfied with Castellano's leadership, regarding the boss too isolated and greedy. He lacks the street credibility that commands respect in their world. The old way of doing things is dying, replaced by a boss who seems more interested in construction contracts than the blood oath of La Cosa Nostra. The drug indictment terrifies Gotti. As captain, he knows he will be held responsible for his crew's transgressions. Following the FBI's indictment of members of Gotti's crew for selling narcotics, Gotti begins to fear that Castellano will kill him and his brother Gene. Gotti attempts to smooth things over, asking Della Croce to intercede on his behalf, but fate intervenes in the most devastating way possible.
Chapter 6: Death of the Peacekeeper. On December 2, 1985, Agnello Della Croce dies of lung cancer at age 71 at Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens. The man who mentored Gotti, who held the family together, who kept the peace between the old guard and the new boss, is gone. The death of Della Croce essentially leads to war in the family, as it had been Della Croce who held back John Gotti from making any moves against Paul Castellano during the 1980s. For years, despite mounting grievances, the street crews respected Della Croce enough not to rebel. But now the constraint is gone, and Castellano makes a fatal mistake. After Della Croce's death, Castellano revises his succession plan, appointing Thomas Bilotti as underboss and making plans to break up Gotti's crew. Worse still, Castellano doesn't attend Della Croce's funeral. Gotti views this behavior as disrespectful and, according to later testimony, decides to take action. The insult cannot stand. In the world of La Cosa Nostra, respect is everything. Without it, you are nothing. And a boss who won't pay respects to a man like Della Croce, a man who served the family for decades, has forfeited his right to lead. Chapter 7. The Sparks Steakhouse Hit. December 16, 1985. The streets of Manhattan glitter with Christmas decorations. Holiday shoppers crowd the sidewalks, unaware that they are about to witness one of the most brazen mob hits in history. At approximately 5:26 p.m., outside Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street, 70-year-old Paul Castellano, apparent successor of recently deceased underboss Agnello Della Croce, steps from a black Lincoln sedan alongside his driver and new underboss, Thomas Bilotti. Four men in beige trench coats and Russian-style fur hats move through the crowd. They're professionals, calm and deliberate. The gunfire erupts without warning. Castellano is gunned down along with Bilotti in front of the restaurant. Both men fall to the Manhattan pavement, their blood mixing with the winter slush. Across the street, John Gotti watches from a parked car with Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano. Gotti has one of his men drive him by the scene to make sure his deadly orders have been carried out. According to Gravano's later testimony, he and Gotti watched the shooting from behind tinted windows of a Lincoln Continental parked nearby, then coolly drive past the bullet-riddled bodies. Gravano would later recount, "I looked down at Tommy Bilotti and I said he was gone." The hit is successful. The old boss is dead. Within weeks, John Gotti is elected boss of the Gambino crime family. At 45 years old, he becomes head of New York's most powerful criminal organization. But this ascension, achieved through murder and betrayal, carries within it the poison of its own making. The planned hit is the first unsanctioned assassination of a boss of the five families since Frank Costello was nearly killed in 1957. The other families are furious. Gotti has violated the most fundamental rules of the commission, but he has the support of several important figures in the Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families, and the blessing of Gambino consigliere Joseph N. Gallo. The Dapper Don has arrived, and the streets of New York will never be the same. Act 3. The Teflon Years. Chapter 8. The Celebrity Gangster. John Gotti is unlike any mob boss America has ever seen. Where previous bosses cultivated anonymity, hiding in the shadows, maintaining the fiction of legitimate businesses, Gotti embraces celebrity. While his peers generally avoid attracting attention, especially from the media, Gotti becomes known as the Dapper Don for his expensive clothes and outspoken personality in front of news cameras. At the peak of his power, His silvery hair is styled in a swept-back coiffure, and he favors $2,000 Brioni double-breasted suits accessorized by $400 hand-painted floral silk ties. A lavish spender, he relishes rare brandy costing $1,000 a bottle and is unconcerned about losing as much as $250,000 in a dice game. The tabloids love him. Photographers camp outside the Ravenite Social Club. TV crews follow his movements. He waves to cameras. He smiles for reporters. He becomes, in the words of one FBI agent, the first media Don. Mafia informants tell prosecutors Gotti receives more than $10 million in cash each year as his share of the Gambino's criminal activities. Gravano puts Gotti's annual take at over $1 million from street construction shakedowns alone. When reportedly asked if he dislikes being referred to as the Dapper Don, Gotti replies, "No, this is my public. They love me." But there is a darkness behind the expensive suits and confident smiles. Secretly recorded tapes and testimony from former mobsters paint a sinister picture of Gotti as a narcissistic tyrant with a furious temper who betrays allies and mercilessly orders the slaying of Gambino loyalists he suspects of being informers or who he thinks have not shown him proper respect. Chapter 9: The First Trials. The FBI has been watching, waiting, building their case. By the early 1980s, using Title III wiretaps, mob informants, and undercover agents, the FBI begins getting clear insights into the Gambino family's hierarchy and activities. March 1985. Gotti is indicted alongside Della Croce and several Bergen crew members in a racketeering case. The indictment is explosive. It reveals that Gotti's friend and co-defendant, Wilfred Willie Boy Johnson, has been an FBI informant. The trial begins in March 1986. Defense attorney Bruce Cutler is loud, aggressive, brilliant. He attacks the credibility of prosecution witnesses, discussing the crimes they committed before turning state evidence. The government's case seems strong, but something is happening behind the scenes. On March 13, 1987, the jury acquits Gotti and his co-defendants of all charges. The streets erupt in celebration. The Teflon Don has done it again. Charges don't stick. But the celebration is premature. 5 years later, juror George Pape is convicted of obstruction of justice for accepting a $60,000 bribe to vote for Gotti's acquittal. The trial was rigged from the start. More trials follow. Each time, Gotti walks free, through jury tampering, through intimidation, through skilled legal defense. He earns the nickname Teflon Don after 3 high-profile trials in the 1980s resulted in acquittals, though later revealed the trials had been tainted by jury tampering, juror misconduct, and witness intimidation. The FBI grows increasingly frustrated. How can they convict a man who corrupts every trial? How can justice prevail when the defendant can reach the jury, the witnesses, even the system itself? The answer lies in patience, technology, and waiting for the inevitable crack in Gotti's armor. Chapter 10: The Surveillance. The Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy becomes Gotti's headquarters. It's here that he holds court, conducts business, meets with his captains. Beginning in January 1988, Gotti requires his captains to meet with him weekly at the club. It's a display of power, but also a catastrophic error in judgment. The FBI has been planning, preparing. In 1990, federal agents raid the Ravenite Social Club, which the FBI has successfully bugged for years. But the bugs aren't just in the club itself. By the late 1980s, the FBI installs eavesdropping equipment in an apartment above the social club Gotti frequents, recording conversations implicating him, Gravano, and family consigliere Frank Locascio. The tapes are devastating. Gotti's voice, clear and unmistakable, discusses murders as casually as business deals. He acknowledges his position as boss. He talks about killing Paul Castellano. He mentions killing his own men when they displease him. He criticizes his underboss, Sammy Gravano, suggesting Gravano is too greedy, too aggressive. These tapes will change everything. The Teflon is about to peel away, revealing the truth beneath.
Act 4. The Betrayal. Chapter 11. The Seeds of Doubt. Based on tapes from FBI bugs played at pre-trial hearings, the Gambino administration is denied bail. At the same time, defense attorneys Bruce Cutler and Gerald Shargel are disqualified after prosecutors successfully contend they are part of the evidence and thus liable to be called as witnesses. The government argues that Cutler and Shargel not only knew about potential criminal activity, but had worked as in-house counsel for the Gambino family. For Gotti, losing his favorite lawyers is a serious blow. But far worse is what the tapes reveal to his underboss. The tapes create a rift between Gotti and Gravano. The Gambino boss describes his newly appointed underboss as too greedy and attempts to frame Gravano as the main force behind the murders of Robert DiBernardo, Liborio Milito, and Louis DeBono. Sammy the Bull Gravano sits in his cell listening to these recordings. The man he helped make boss, the man he sat beside while Paul Castellano was murdered, the man for whom he committed 19 murders, this man is setting him up to take the fall. Gotti's attempt at reconciliation fails, leaving Gravano disillusioned with the mob and doubtful of his chances of winning his case without Shargel, his former attorney. Gravano understands the reality of his situation. The tapes implicate him in multiple murders. Without a miracle, he's facing life in prison. And Gotti, rather than standing by his underboss, is throwing him to the wolves. Chapter 12. The Turn. The decision doesn't come easily. Gravano reaches out through his wife Debbie, using her as an intermediary to approach the prosecution, a move contrary to one of the basic instincts of a true mobster, which is to keep a strict separation of family from the family. Gravano realizes that the worst possible outcome would be if he tried to cooperate but failed, and Gotti knew he'd tried. He would be considered a rat for making the effort, sent back to jail, placed in solitary confinement for his own protection, and become no different than Willie Boy Johnson. The FBI initially can't believe it. On November 13, 1991, Gravano formally agrees to turn state evidence. He becomes the highest-ranking member of a New York crime family to turn informer until Joseph Massino in 2003. The decision violates everything La Cosa Nostra stands for. The code of Omertà, silence unto death, is the most sacred oath a made man takes. Betrayal means death, not just for the traitor, but potentially for his entire family. But Gravano makes his choice. Of all the possible turns the case could have taken, this was the one nobody had even speculated about. 6 weeks later, when Gravano's cooperation becomes public, dozens of smart alecks suddenly claimed they knew he'd flip. But before it actually happened, nobody had whispered the possibility. The Gambino family's most powerful enforcer, the man who helped orchestrate the Castellano hit, the underboss who knew every secret, has decided to destroy John Gotti. Act 5. The Trial of the Century. Chapter 13. The Courtroom. January 1992.
The trial begins in U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York before District Judge I. Leo Glasser. Jury selection begins with an anonymous jury that is, for the first time in a Brooklyn federal case, fully sequestered during the trial due to Gotti's reputation for jury tampering. The security is unprecedented. The jurors are identified only by number. They're kept in an undisclosed location, transported under guard, isolated from any possible corruption or intimidation. The government has learned from past failures. Gotti is charged with racketeering conspiracy, murder, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, and conspiracies to murder, bribe a detective, obstruct justice, commit loan sharking, and commit tax fraud. Gotti has hired Albert Krieger, a Miami attorney who worked with Joseph Bonanno, to replace Bruce Cutler. But without his favorite lawyer, without his ability to corrupt the jury, Gotti seems diminished. On February 12, 1992, opening statements are given. In Krieger's statement, he describes Gravano as a little man full of evil, connivance, manipulation, and vanity, who has tried to clear his slate by admitting to 19 murders. Staring intently at the jury box, he bellows, "There are only 18 of you here. We don't have enough chairs to put all the victims in." It's dramatic, it's powerful, but the tapes tell a different story. The prosecution's opening statements begin by playing tapes from FBI bugs recorded at various Gotti locations. For days, the courtroom listens to Gotti's voice, arrogant, profane, incriminating, discussing murders, racketeering, the inner workings of the Gambino family. Outside the courthouse, a circus atmosphere prevails. Gotti loyalists orchestrate demonstrations of support. But inside, the evidence mounts, damning and irrefutable. Chapter 14. Sammy takes the stand. On March 2, 1992, prosecutors bring Salvatore Gravano to testify. The moment is electric. Gotti stares at his former underboss with undisguised hatred. In the gallery, Gotti's supporters glare at the traitor who dared break Omertà. On the stand, Gravano confirms Gotti's place in the structure of the Gambino family and describes in detail the conspiracy to assassinate Castellano, giving a full description of the hit and its aftermath. Gravano confesses to involvement in 19 murders, implicating Gotti in 10 of them. "Sometimes I was the shooter, sometimes I was a backup guy, sometimes I set the guy up, sometimes I just talked about it," Gravano testifies. For 9 days, Gravano testifies. He describes the internal structure of La Cosa Nostra, the initiation ceremonies, the hierarchy, the rules. He talks about murders committed on Gotti's orders. He describes how Gotti became increasingly paranoid, violent, unpredictable. According to Gravano, he and Gotti planned Castellano's killing because Castellano had got too greedy and was selling out the family for his own basic businesses. The defense attacks viciously. Krieger and Locaccio's attorney Anthony Cardinelli prove unable to shake Gravano during cross-examination. They call him a liar, a murderer, a rat. They point out he's testifying to save himself, trading his knowledge for leniency. Gravano admits his hopes for leniency, but his testimony remains unshaken. During the testimony, Peter D'Angelo, a young member of the family, arises from his seat, slowly shuffles towards the main aisle, pauses for a dramatic stare at Gravano, exits the courtroom, and later returns. The move rattles Gravano, but solidifies his resolve. After court adjourns, Gravano spews his wrath. "Did you see that kid? I helped him out his whole life. 3 years ago, he came to me begging for work. Now he comes here and tries to rattle me. Get up, walk out, come back. What's this, a movie? Fuck him, and fuck them." Gotti himself becomes increasingly hostile during the trial. At one point, Glasser threatens to remove him from the courtroom. Among other outbursts, Gotti calls Gravano a junkie while his attorneys seek to discuss his past steroid use. The trial becomes a spectacle of mob justice colliding with American jurisprudence. But this time, justice has the upper hand. Chapter 15. The Verdict. After additional testimony and tapes, the government rests its case on March 24, 1992. 5 of Krieger and Cardinale's intended 6 witnesses are ruled irrelevant or extraneous, leaving only Gotti's tax attorney Murray Appleman to testify on his behalf. The jury deliberates. After only 14 hours of deliberation, they return to the courtroom. On April 2, 1992, the jury finds Gotti guilty on all 13 counts of the indictment. The head of the FBI's New York office famously remarks, "The Don is covered with Velcro and every charge stuck."
The Teflon Don is finished. John Gotti, the man who believed himself invincible, the celebrity gangster who thought he could outsmart the government forever, has been convicted of murder, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and a litany of other crimes. On June 23, 1992, Judge Glasser sentences Gotti and Locascio to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and a $250,000 fine. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of Gotti supporters riot, overturning cars, clashing with police. But inside, the verdict is final and absolute. The king of New York's underworld is going to prison for the rest of his life. Act 6. The Cage. Chapter 16. Marion. The same day he is sentenced, Gotti, who previously refused to fly because of his fear of airplane crashes, is put aboard a plane and flown to the maximum security federal prison in Marion, Illinois. He is transferred to United States Penitentiary Marion, at that time the nation's highest security prison. From 1992 until 2000, Gotti is kept in virtual solitary confinement, restricted to his cell except for 1 hour of daily exercise in a cell block or courtyard. He spends 23 hours a day in a tiny prison cell at Marion. The conditions are brutal, designed to break even the strongest men. But Gotti maintains his pride, his code, his identity as a gangster. He is an old-school gangster who prides himself on sticking to the code of Omertà. A life sentence with no possibility of parole does nothing to hinder his obsession with being boss of the Gambino family. His orders are relayed through his son John Jr., whom he names acting boss shortly after his 1992 conviction, and through his brother Peter Gotti. But the son is not the father. John Jr. became an official member of the Gambino family in 1988 and became the youngest capo in the family's history in his mid-20s, but his promotion to acting boss doesn't sit well with everyone in the organization. In March 1993, a federal grand jury begins probing Jr.'s role in the Gambino hierarchy. The younger Gotti meets with his crew on Wednesday nights at the Our Friends Social Club in South Ozone Park, Queens. The investigation casts a shadow over his leadership, but he continues to relay his father's orders and maintain control of the family. In 1998, federal authorities charged Jr. with a broad range of crimes, including loan sharking, bookmaking, extortion, bribery, mail fraud, gambling, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The government freezes his assets, making it impossible to support his family or pay legal fees. The pressure mounts unbearably. In prison, the elder Gotti pressures his son to fight the charges, to uphold the family honor, to never cooperate. But Jr. sees the writing on the wall.
Faced with a mountain of evidence and the prospect of 20 years or more in prison, John Gotti Jr. meets with his father one final time before accepting a plea deal in April 1999. It's their last conversation. The elder Gotti tries to convince his son to fight, to be a proud member of the mob. But ultimately, he relents. "John, if this is what you want to do, you're your own man," Gotti tells his son. "But they will never leave you alone. The government will never accept it." In September 1999, John Gotti Jr. is sentenced to nearly 6.5 years in prison. The Gotti legacy begins to crumble. The son has chosen a different path than the father, not out of weakness, but out of a desire to have a life beyond prison walls. Chapter 17: The Disease. In 1998, doctors diagnosed John Gotti with throat cancer. He is transferred from Marion to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, where surgeons successfully removed a tumor from his neck and head. For a brief moment, it seems the Dapper Don might survive his sentence after all. The surgery is successful. The cancer appears to be gone. But in the spring of 2000, the disease returns with a vengeance. The cancer spreads aggressively. Lesions form on his tongue, neck, and cheeks. The man who once commanded respect through presence and power becomes gaunt and frail. His silver hair falls out. His expensive suits are replaced by prison hospital gowns. The ravages of cancer and years of incarceration erase the cockiness and flamboyant style of the man who once dominated New York's underworld. A photograph taken in October 2001, less than 8 months before his death, shows a man barely recognizable. Gaunt, nearly bald, staring grimly at the camera in a gray t-shirt. He looks decades older than his 61 years. The Dapper Don is gone. In his place is a dying man, ravaged by disease and isolation. His daughter Victoria later describes the photos as sad, noting that her father's last wish was that his grandchildren never see him in such a diminished state. His attorney, Bruce Cutler, laments, "That's what cancer and illness does to people. We should remember John as a remarkable person, physically, mentally, and emotionally." But the prison system sees only an inmate. When the prison requests permission to perform an autopsy after Gotti's inevitable death, Cutler protests, "There's no need for it. We know what killed him." Chapter 18: The End of an Era. On June 10, 2002, at approximately 12:45 p.m., John Joseph Gotti Jr. dies at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He is 61 years old. The cause is throat cancer, the same disease that claimed his voice, his dignity, and ultimately his life. The Dapper Don, the Teflon Don, the man who smiled at cameras and defied the government, dies alone in a prison hospital, far from the streets that made him, far from the family he led, far from the empire he built through blood and violence. Act 7: The Aftermath. Chapter 19: The Broken Family. The Gambino crime family, once the most powerful criminal organization in America, never recovers from John Gotti's downfall. The 1990s see wave after wave of arrests, indictments, and plea bargains. The Ravenite Social Club, that notorious headquarters in Manhattan's Little Italy, where Gotti proudly held court, is confiscated by the government and sold to real estate developers. The command structure Gotti built crumbles. His son, despite his father's wishes, leaves the life. John Jr. faces multiple trials after his release from prison in 2002. The government charges him with racketeering, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to murder radio host Curtis Sliwa, who had called the elder Gotti public enemy #1 on air. 3 separate trials end in mistrials between 2005 and 2006. The juries can't reach verdicts, though some jurors later say they believed Jr. was guilty. Finally, in 2010, federal prosecutors announced they will no longer pursue charges against him. John Jr. maintains he has left the Gambino family, retreating to a quiet life in Oyster Bay Cove on Long Island with his wife and 6 children. Peter Gotti, John's brother, assumes control of the family shortly before John's death. But he lacks his brother's charisma, his strategic mind, his ability to command respect. In 2003, Peter is arrested and charged with racketeering and conspiracy. He is convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He never experiences freedom again, dying behind bars in February 2021 of natural causes. The family passes through various hands, Nicholas Carrazzo, Domenico Cefalu, but it never regains its former power. The FBI's systematic dismantling of the organization, combined with the loss of leadership and the breaking of Omertà, destroyed what took decades to build. Chapter 20: The Turncoat's Legacy. Salvatore Gravano, the man whose testimony destroyed John Gotti, serves only 5 years in prison despite confessing to 19 murders. It's an astonishing bargain, one of the most controversial deals in the history of law enforcement. Upon his release in 1995, Gravano enters the witness protection program with his family. But he can't stay hidden.
The old life calls to him. In 1999, he leaves the program and relocates to Arizona, where he starts a swimming pool installation business. He writes a book, gives interviews, becomes a strange sort of celebrity, part killer, part historian, part cautionary tale. But Gravano can't escape his nature. In 2000, he is arrested for operating an ecstasy drug ring in Arizona. Despite his cooperation against Gotti, despite his years as a protected witness, Gravano returns to crime. In 2002, he pleads guilty to racketeering charges related to the drug trafficking operation and is sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. He is released in 2017, having served the bulk of his sentence. By then, he's in his 70s, a relic of a bygone era. He starts a podcast called Our Thing, discussing his life in the mob, giving insights into organized crime, maintaining that he has no regrets about testifying against Gotti. Sammy helped me shut out the rest of the family and bosses and underbosses of the other families, FBI agent George Gabriel reflects. The agent credits Gravano's cooperation with the demise of organized crime in New York. But the cost was steep. Gravano violated the most sacred oath a mobster can take. In the world of La Cosa Nostra, that sin is unforgivable. He lives the rest of his life as a pariah in that world, respected by law enforcement, despised by those who still hold to the old code. Chapter 21: The Lessons Unlearned. Looking back at John Gotti's rise and fall, several truths emerge about the nature of power, pride, and the inevitable consequences of a life built on violence. Gotti's need for attention was his undoing. Previous mob bosses understood that anonymity was protection. Carlo Gambino, who built the family into a powerhouse, lived modestly, avoided cameras, cultivated the appearance of a legitimate businessman. Paul Castellano, for all his faults, maintained a low profile compared to his successor. But Gotti craved the spotlight. He loved being photographed, being recognized, being celebrated. The tabloids called him the Dapper Don, and he embraced the nickname. He believed his own legend, that he was smarter than the FBI, that he could beat any charge, that he was untouchable. That arrogance made him reckless. By requiring his captains to meet with him weekly at the Ravenite, he provided the FBI with a perfect opportunity for surveillance. By discussing sensitive business in locations that could be bugged, he created the evidence that would convict him.
By criticizing Gravano on recorded conversations, he drove his underboss into the arms of federal prosecutors. What John Gotti did was the beginning of the end of Cosa Nostra, observes Anthony Gaspipe Casso, former underboss of the Lucchese crime family. The unsanctioned murder of Paul Castellano, the celebrity status, the constant media attention, all of it brought unprecedented scrutiny to the Mafia. The five families, which had operated for decades in relative secrecy, suddenly found themselves under an FBI microscope. The breaking of Omertà accelerated the collapse. When Gravano testified, he didn't just destroy Gotti, he showed other mobsters that cooperation was possible, that the code could be broken, that survival might be found on the other side of betrayal. In the years following Gravano's testimony, more and more made men decided to cooperate rather than face life sentences. Joseph Messino, boss of the Bonanno family, becomes a government informant in 2004. Other high-ranking mobsters follow. The wall of silence that protected the Mafia for generations crumbles, and with it, much of the organization's power. Chapter 22: The Ghosts. The victims of John Gotti's ambition are countless. The obvious ones are those he ordered killed: Paul Castellano, shot down outside Sparks Steakhouse; Thomas Bilotti, murdered alongside his boss; Robert DiBernardo, Louis De Bono, Louis Milito, and others whose bodies were found in car trunks, dumpsters, construction sites. But there are other victims, the families of those murdered men, the businesses extorted, the workers intimidated, the legitimate entrepreneurs driven out by mob influence, the neighborhoods corrupted by gambling operations and loan sharking, the lives destroyed by the drug trade that enriched the Gambino family despite official prohibitions. John Favara, the neighbor who accidentally killed Frank Gotti, vanishes without a trace, his body never found. His family spends decades not knowing what happened to him, whether he's alive or dead, what terrible fate befell him for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The FBI agents who spent years building cases against Gotti, who saw those cases collapse through jury tampering and witness intimidation, who worked tirelessly to bring him to justice, they are victims too, in a sense. Victims of a system that could be corrupted, that allowed a criminal to walk free time and again, despite overwhelming evidence. And perhaps most tragically, Gotti's own family. His wife Victoria, who watched her husband destroy their family through his obsession with power and respect. His children, who grew up in the shadow of organized crime, who faced constant FBI surveillance, who couldn't escape their father's legacy. His son Frank, killed at 12, whose death may have been avenged, but was no less permanent for that vengeance. John Jr., who followed his father into the life and then spent years trying to escape it, facing trial after trial, unable to convince prosecutors he'd truly left the mob. Victoria Gotti, who became an author and reality television star, forever known as the mob boss's daughter. The other children who chose different paths but could never outrun the name Gotti.
Epilogue: The Legacy. Chapter 23: The Myth and the Man. More than 2 decades after his death, John Gotti remains a figure of fascination. Books, movies, documentaries, podcasts all continue to explore his life, his crimes, his impact on American organized crime. Some portray him as a romantic figure, a last representative of the old Mafia code of honor. These depictions emphasize his loyalty to his crew, his refusal to cooperate even when facing life in prison, his defiant stance against authority. They focus on the expensive suits, the confident smile, the crowds of supporters at his trials. But this romanticized version of John Gotti ignores the reality of what he was: a violent criminal who ordered murders, who extorted legitimate businesses, who corrupted the legal system, who lived by a code that destroyed lives and families. The tapes from the Ravenite revealed the true John Gotti, a narcissistic tyrant with a furious temper who betrayed allies and mercilessly ordered the slaying of anyone he suspected of disloyalty or disrespect, a man who valued his own pride and power above everything, including the safety of his own organization. Quote, "There are only 18 of you here," defense attorney Albert Krieger told the jury during Gotti's trial, referring to Gravano's confession to 19 murders. "We don't have enough chairs to put all the victims in." End quote. That's the reality of John Gotti's legacy. Not the expensive suits and media attention, but the bodies, the broken families, the lives cut short by violence. Chapter 24. The Closing. On a cold day in June 2002, as John Gotti's casket was lowered into the Gotti family mausoleum, some of those present saw a hero being laid to rest. Others saw a monster finally getting what he deserved. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between the extremes, but closer to the latter than many want to admit. The Dapper Don built his empire on blood and violence consumed him. He rose to power through the murder of his predecessor, and he fell through the betrayal of his closest ally. The Teflon that seemed to protect him through the 1980s couldn't save him in the end. Nothing could. In the years since his death, the Gambino crime family has continued in diminished form. New bosses have risen and fallen. The FBI continues its war against organized crime. The cycle of violence and retribution continues, though on a smaller scale than in Gotti's heyday. But the lessons of John Gotti's downfall remain clear. Pride comes before the fall. Arrogance breeds recklessness. The need for attention can destroy even the most powerful. And in the end, no one is above the law, not forever, not ultimately, not when the weight of evidence becomes overwhelming and allies turn into enemies. The streets that made John Gotti eventually turned against him. The organization he led crumbled under the scrutiny his celebrity brought. The code he claimed to live by was broken by the man he trusted most. And the life he built, expensive, violent, proud, ended in a prison hospital bed, alone and diminished, a shadow of the man who once ruled New York's underworld.